Billionaire secretly followed his maid. Her actions towards his paralyzed child shocked him. Jonathan Miller opened the monitoring app with a heart clenched in suspicion, bracing himself for disappointment only to be brought to his knees by what he saw. 9 caretakers had come and gone. They had stolen from him, lied to him. They had treated his twin sons paralyzed since birth, not as children in need of love, but as burdens to be endured. So when he checked his phone on a quiet May afternoon, he was already steeled for the inevitable failure of the 10th. He expected betrayal. He expected heartbreak. What he did not expect was the sight that made his phone slip from his hand and clatter to the floor. In the center of the sunlit living room of his aging Charleston estate, beneath the soft glow of late-day light cascading across polished wood floors, his 2 sons, Lucas and Noah, the very boys once declared incapable of ever standing, were on their feet, standing. Their small bodies trembled, their steps wavered, but they were upright. No braces, no wheelchair, no hands holding them up. A few feet away, Elena, the young caregiver he still didn't fully trust, knelt on the floor, arms wide open, eyes shining with tears and hope so raw it pierced through the camera's microphone. Her voice came through hoarse but steady. "Come on, my loves, just one step." And they moved, one step, then another, toward her, toward the only person who had ever believed they could do the impossible. Jonathan collapsed to the floor, his back against the wall, legs numb, heart racing. On the small screen still glowing in his trembling hands, the impossible unfolded in real time, not in someone else's story, not in some faraway miracle, but in his own home. Just 3 years ago, he had stood in stunned silence outside the emergency room doors when the doctors told him Grace, his beloved wife, his partner, the woman who had dreamed of children with him for nearly a decade, had not survived the birth of their twins. 35 minutes after Lucas and Noah came into the world, she was gone, leaving Jonathan alone with 2 fragile infants and a sorrow too deep to name. That very same day, as his newborn sons, each weighing barely more than 4 pounds, were wheeled into incubators, the doctors delivered a second blow that froze Jonathan's world in place. Severe cerebral palsy, little to no chance of walking, possibly no speech, no hugs, no laughter, no running, no normal life. Jonathan had listened, he had understood, and he had believed. In the years that followed, he did everything a father could do. He hired nurses, bought cutting-edge medical equipment, flew in rehabilitation experts from world-renowned hospitals, but all he received in return was silence, stillness. Lucas and Noah did not move, did not respond, did not smile, did not follow light with their eyes. They sat in custom-built wheelchairs, distant and motionless, arms limp, gazes hollow. Jonathan withdrew too, living behind locked doors, managing life through surveillance cameras, commands, and an ever-growing wall of mistrust. Until today. Today, his sons, the very boys the world had long since written off, were stepping slow and unsteady, but stepping toward a woman he had once dismissed as just another temporary hire. Elena did not cheer, she did not shout. She wept quietly and whispered as though unwilling to disturb the sacredness of the moment unfolding before her. Lucas smiled. Noah trembled but did not stop. And Jonathan, who had buried all hope alongside Grace in the small cemetery behind the old church, now sat helpless on the floor, watching a miracle take shape in his own home. He did not know if this was the beginning or just a fleeting glimpse of what might be. But for the first time in 3 long years, something inside him stirred back to life. He could not stop watching, could not stop shaking, could not stop crying. Because what he saw today was not merely 2 children learning to walk, it was the rebirth of belief. It was past, present, and future converging into every trembling step of 2 tiny souls, once sentenced to a lifetime of stillness. And perhaps what broke Jonathan Miller most was not that his sons had finally learned to walk, but that they had never stopped trying. All this time, they had never given up. It was just that no one had ever believed enough to see it. If you're still with us at this point in the story, thank you for giving us a few precious moments of your day to step into this deeply emotional world. Stories like this are not just meant to be heard, but to be felt, to be reflected upon, and sometimes to gently heal something quiet inside us. If your heart stirred with each word, don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone you believe might be in need of a little light in their life. Every time you share, you help build a bridge that carries these real and tender stories to more hearts each day. And where are you listening from? Leave us a comment below and let us know the corner of the world where this story has found you. Now we invite you to return with us to the tear-filled and hope-laced journey of Jonathan in the next chapter of our story. In the moment his two sons rose to their feet beneath the soft light of the late afternoon sun, a flood of memory crashed through Jonathan, dragging him helplessly back to a day 3 years earlier when his life was torn apart beyond recognition. Charleston Memorial Hospital still smelled of antiseptic then, and the cold white lights cast a pale hue across Grace's face, making her look tired but at peace. She had gripped Jonathan's hand before they wheeled her into the delivery room, whispering that everything would be fine, that this would be the most beautiful day of their lives. They had waited too long for these children, endured failed IVF attempts, months and years of rising hope and falling despair. And then a miracle, the announcement that she was carrying twins. But that miracle lasted only until the morning of their birth. The delivery was faster than anyone expected and far more dangerous. When Lucas and Noah let out their thin, uncertain cries from inside the incubators, Jonathan thought a new, radiant chapter of life was beginning. But just over 30 minutes later, a doctor called him into the emergency room. Complications, they said. Massive blood loss. Her heart was no longer responding. Jonathan stood by her bedside, clutching her hand as it cooled beneath his fingers, as though the life was slipping out of her one finger at a time. He called her name, begged her to open her eyes. But the only sound in the room was the steady slowing of the heart monitor until it stopped altogether. And when the doctor gently pulled the sheet over Grace's face, Jonathan felt the world tilt and collapse around him in a single shattering instant. He left the ER with legs that no longer felt like his own. The hallway seemed impossibly long, the neon lights harsh and yet dim through his tears. He wandered toward the neonatal intensive care unit where Lucas and Noah lay inside their fragile, transparent cocoons. Two tiny bodies, two rising and falling chests, two pairs of eyes still closed to the world. Jonathan placed a hand against the cool glass and whispered that he would take care of them for Grace, that he would do everything in his power to raise them strong and healthy. But even as those promises passed, his lips a doctor pulled him aside and handed him a thick folder. The doctor spoke slowly, gently, as if afraid the next blow would be too much for Jonathan to bear. The twins had suffered brain damage from being born prematurely, a severe form of cerebral palsy, very limited motor control, little to no chance of ever standing or walking. Jonathan heard the words, but they barely landed. His mind was still struggling to comprehend that he had lost. Grace lost the half of his soul that had made the world feel possible. And now they were telling him he would lose even the simplest hopes he had for his sons. He walked out to the hospital parking lot, leaned against the side of his dust-covered black car, and wept harder than he ever had before. The wind from the Ashley River cut through the air with biting chill, but the cold inside him was worse. From that day forward, the darkness began to seep into every part of Jonathan's life. He returned to the old Charleston home that he and Grace had restored with dreams of raising their children within its warm walls, but now the house echoed with memories of futures that never came. Wedding photos, paintings Grace had chosen for the walls, the neatly folded baby clothes she had prepared before the birth. All of it became knives he stumbled into each day. Jonathan barely slept. He spoke to no one. He was no longer the confident man who had once led one of the region's top architectural firms. He became a shadow of himself, shuttling between hospitals and home, then from home to therapy centers, where he clung to the hope that something, anything, might change the course of Lucas and Noah's lives. But as months passed, as expensive therapy sessions piled up, as specialists came and went, as reassurances were softly repeated, nothing changed. The boys remained silent in their wheelchairs, heads often slumped forward, arms stiffened by their condition, their eyes vacant and unseeing. Slowly, Jonathan began to accept the doctor's words as immutable truth. That hope, in the end, was only a doorway to more pain. Over those 3 long years, his heart closed in on itself, as cold and quiet as the house where he now lived alone, with 2 children who could not even call him by name. Then, one day, burdened by the weight of his helplessness, Jonathan began installing cameras in every room of the house, as if surveillance was the only way left to hold on to something that was quietly falling apart. 3 years passed in a haze of shadow. 3 years during which Jonathan never stepped foot into the nursery Grace had lovingly prepared. 3 years in which he watched his sons more often through screens than through his own eyes. 3 years of pain and fear of surviving more than living. And then today, those 3 years of darkness dissolved in a single, impossible instant. He saw what he had never dared to imagine. The 2 children, once condemned to a lifetime without movement, were walking. Step by trembling step, they moved toward the light, toward a woman who still believed in what he had long since given up. But the darkness had not begun solely with Grace's death. It began moments after, when Jonathan was ushered into a small consultation room adjacent to the neonatal ward. The quiet hum of the air conditioning and the dull white lighting gave the room the sterile chill of a place meant for delivering sentences, not comfort. A pediatric neurologist placed a folder on the table, his hands laced tightly, bracing to say the unsayable. Jonathan sat across from him, eyes red, his shirt still stained with traces of Grace's blood. The doctor began slowly, cautiously explaining that Lucas and Noah had arrived weeks too early, that oxygen deprivation had caused visible damage to their developing brains. He spoke of the motor pathways not responding as they should, of natural reflexes barely present. Each word fell like the soft drip of water onto cold stone, steady and numbing. Then came the sentence that would echo through Jonathan's mind for the next 3 years like a bell tolling in the dark. The likelihood of independent movement is nearly non-existent. The doctor explained how this form of cerebral palsy directly affected the boys' ability to control their muscles. That voluntary motion would be severely limited, that they may never stand, never walk without assistance. That running, playing, even simple movements could remain out of reach for life. There was no miracle to wait for, no full recovery to hope for. Jonathan felt the walls of the room closing and the very air being pressed from his lungs. He remembered asking if there was anything, any treatment, any trial, any experimental therapy that could alter the course of this diagnosis. Anything at all. The doctor only shook his head, his eyes heavy with compassion. The best they could do, he said, was to help the boys adapt to the limits of the lives they had been given. Limits. That word became a rope tied tightly around Jonathan's heart. Through the glass window, he looked into the neonatal ward where his sons lay in their tiny incubators, swaddled in soft blankets, blue knit caps covering their heads. They didn't know that their mother was gone. They didn't know that the lives they had just begun had already been labeled with the word impossible. And Jonathan, in that moment, wondered how he would ever explain it to Grace if she were still here. She had imagined them running in the backyard, playing ball, falling and getting back up again. That was the dream she had held onto through every failed procedure, every night spent praying for children. And now, in the space of a single day, that dream had shattered into pieces right before Jonathan's eyes. The weeks that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of doctor visits, developmental assessments, and long impersonal reports filled with clinical terms that Jonathan read again and again, even when he couldn't bear to believe what they said. Every time he asked about the possibility of improvement, the answers stayed the same. Difficult, limited, minimal. Some children, they said, might eventually be able to hold their heads up better. A few might gain minor control of their hands. But the hope of independent movement, of walking freely, was almost non-existent. The more Jonathan listened, the more it felt like he was drifting further from real life, caught in an invisible storm, unable to find anything solid to hold on to. The day he brought the twins home in their tiny wheelchairs, he paused at the iron gate of the old house he and Grace had once filled with hope. He carried Noah first, then Lucas, and the weight, or lack of it, of their small bodies made his grief even heavier. He placed them in the new therapy room, hastily set up in place of the nursery. The air was thick with the sterile smell of new plastic and medical equipment, and there wasn't a single trace left of the home he and Grace had imagined. He tried to be strong, tried to keep the promise he had whispered to Grace in that hospital that he would care for their children with everything he had. But when night fell, when the soft beeping of heart monitors echoed through the silence, when the whole house stood still, Jonathan broke. He realized then that he had not only lost Grace on that day, he had lost the future they had built in their hearts. And from that moment on, Jonathan lived with a quiet, crushing fear that every door had been permanently closed for his sons. He believed the doctors because belief in anything else would mean facing a world too painful to survive. He never imagined that someday, within the same house soaked in disappointment, someone would walk in and challenge the sentence he had been forced to accept for 3 long years. Jonathan had once believed this house would be where all things beautiful began. He and Grace had spent nearly a year searching, walking through neighborhood after neighborhood beneath Charleston's tree-lined streets, until they stood in front of an old estate nestled behind an iron fence and moss-covered stone steps. Grace had stepped into the grand foyer and immediately whispered that this was where she wanted to watch their children grow up. The high arching ceilings, the carved plasterwork, the creaky oak floors, and sun-soaked windows made the house feel like it was already full of stories, as if the walls had been waiting to hold their memories. Jonathan Ever, the architect, had hesitated. He saw the repairs, the hidden costs, the practical concerns. But Grace had only smiled, rested her hand on the cool stone wall, and said these walls needed the sound of children's laughter. They bought the house in the spring. The magnolia tree out front had just begun to bloom, and warm southern breezes carried the scent of flowers through the open windows, filling the house with the breath of something new. Grace poured herself into making the house a home. The living room remained in its antique style, complete with the armchair where she loved to read. Jonathan reworked his office to make space for her easel and paints. But the most precious room was the one meant for their children. When she learned she was carrying twins, Grace seemed to glow with light from within. She chose the nursery walls to be a soft sky blue with hints of white as gentle as morning. On one wall, she painted a mural by hand, even through the aches and fatigue of late pregnancy. 2 bear cubs playing beneath a tree, a swing swaying nearby, little birds flitting across a quiet sky. She said she wanted her children to wake each morning to something that made them smile. The 3 cribs were arranged in a crescent, each one with a hand-stitched pillow bearing a name. Jonathan remembered watching her bend over her sewing, the needle trembling slightly in her tired hands. Noah, Lucas, and one more name. The one she said they would use if there had been a baby girl. That crib was never needed. After the day Grace died, Jonathan locked the nursery door. He could not go in, could not face what was left unfinished, could not bring himself to touch the things she had prepared with such tender love. To him, that door marked the final threshold of memory. To open it would be to unleash all the grief he had spent 3 years trying to contain, and he wasn't sure he could survive it. Every caretaker who came and went was given strict instructions: do not enter the last room at the end of the upstairs hall. They began to call it the forbidden room. Jonathan never mentioned it. To him, it was no longer part of the house, no longer a physical space. It had become another world entirely, a world that had died with Grace. Instead, life slowly migrated to the eastern wing of the house, where Jonathan had built a therapy room outfitted with state-of-the-art equipment, a hospital bed, custom wheelchairs, monitors. Everything was clean, precise, sterile. Gone were the paintings on the walls, the classical music Grace used to play each morning, the quiet afternoons reading beneath the porch roof. The house fell silent in a way that suffocated. The old grandfather clock still chimed each hour, but Jonathan no longer noticed the time. He lived by nurse shifts, motor function evaluations, calls from doctors, and endless footage replayed on security cameras each night. Sometimes in those thin moments just before sleep took him, Jonathan thought he heard Grace whisper his name, softly, so faint it seemed to come from beyond the locked door upstairs. But he never got up to check. He couldn't. He wouldn't cross the line that separated a present full of loss from a past still pulsing with memory. Because he knew that if he opened that door and saw the crib still standing, the rug Grace had picked out, the scent of the oils she used to calm herself at night, if it was all still there, untouched, as if death had never come, he would fall apart. And when a father falls apart, who is left to lift 2 fragile children back up? Jonathan didn't want to answer that question, so he chose the detour, chose silence, chose to keep that room locked like a sacred taboo. The old house Grace had once called their home of love had become a shelter for 3 souls unable to reach one another, a silent father, 2 children who could not speak, and a door that never opened, until the day Elena arrived. And somehow, in a way he never could have predicted, she didn't just open the hearts of 2 little boys. She stirred something in the door Jonathan had sworn he would never open again. She arrived on a quiet morning in early April, just as the magnolia blossoms in the yard were beginning to open. Jonathan stood at the upstairs window, his eyes tracking the silver car as it rolled to a stop at the gate. A woman stepped out, small in stature, hair neatly tied back, carrying a simple canvas bag in one hand. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing that set her apart from the 8 who had come before. And for that very reason, Jonathan felt no spark of hope. He didn't want hope anymore. All he wanted was someone who would come do the job exactly as instructed, stay neither too close nor too distant, and never touch the fragile beliefs he had long since abandoned. Her name was Elena Ramirez, 31 years old, experience with special needs children, a clean record, no criminal history, no ethical violations. The agency representative had described her as the ideal candidate, but Jonathan no longer trusted ideals. He had once trusted. The first time it had been a nurse with a gentle smile who said she loved children. She left after 1 week, sending a message that the house was too heavy, too dark. The second spent most of her time on her phone, secretly filming his sons to send videos to her friends like a joke. The third stole Noah's pain medication and was caught after Jonathan reviewed the surveillance footage. And the fourth, the one he had trusted most, was discovered accessing his personal bank account and disappeared without a trace. 9 people. 9 betrayals, 9 extinguished flames of hope, and now came the 10th. Jonathan opened the door to Elena with a face void of expression. He didn't shake her hand, didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he handed her a printed document outlining everything she needed to do, a strict scheduled dosages for each child and a list of absolute prohibitions. No singing, no storytelling, no rearranging items in the therapy room, no discussing the children's condition with anyone outside of authorized medical personnel, no unnecessary touching, no words of encouragement like "you can do it" or "everything will be okay" or any other statements built on assumptions. Jonathan spoke plainly. This is not a place for goodwill experiments. This is technical work. My children need to be kept safe, clean, and on schedule. No fantasies, no errors. Elena nodded. She said little, showed no reaction. She accepted the instructions and began work that same morning. Jonathan watched quietly through the surveillance system. He didn't speak to her during the first 2 days except for brief reminders about feeding times, medication checks, and therapy appointments. Elena arrived each morning at 7 o'clock sharp, punctual as a metronome. She relieved the night nurse, reviewed the sleep logs, checked the machines, wiped down toys, cleaned the wheelchair railings, and began her duties with meticulous care. Jonathan observed but did not judge. He had grown used to counting the days until someone made their first mistake. 3 days, 4 days, 5. Still no missteps. But he didn't trust it. Her silence made him more wary. He distrusted ease because in his experience those who seemed perfect were simply the best at hiding their faults. Elena never asked personal questions, never spoke of her past, never explained why she chose this work. Jonathan didn't ask either. He didn't need to know where she came from, how many years she had worked, or whether her heart was full of compassion. He only needed her not to hurt his children the way the others had. He only needed things to happen exactly as written in the manual he had created, hour by hour, dose by dose. Keep them safe, keep things stable, keep everything under control. He had lived 3 years inside the wreckage of sorrow and disillusionment, and now numbness seemed like the only thing left that could protect the fragile pieces still remaining. Elena entered that house not as a bearer of hope, but as just another extension of the carefully laid system Jonathan had spent 3 years constructing. He didn't know then that because he expected nothing from her, he also failed to notice how each of her quiet footsteps was slowly, steadily changing the very things he had sealed away for so long. Not through grand gestures, but through stillness, gentleness, and the kind of steadiness known only to those who understand that miracles do not begin with promises, but with nameless patient persistence. At first, Jonathan believed she was the first to follow every rule without exception. She arrived on time. She asked no irrelevant questions. She didn't challenge the restrictions in his instructions. She followed the therapy schedule without deviation. The first few days passed so smoothly that he almost began to believe this time might finally be uneventful. But then one night, as he sat in his office beneath the quiet glow of blue light from 3 surveillance screens, his tired face bathed in its reflection, he saw something that made him freeze. In the therapy room, Elena was sitting between the boys. Not to check a machine, not to log a chart. She was singing, a soft ancient lullaby in Spanish, her voice low and warm like an embrace made of sound. Lucas lay still, his eyes wide open. Noah was not staring blankly into space as usual. He was looking directly at her. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. He didn't know whether to be angry or afraid. She had broken the very first rule. The next morning he said nothing, just watched her walk past in the hallway like every other day, hair tied back, pale shirt, neat expression unreadable. He told himself he would begin reviewing the footage more carefully, and just as he feared, it continued. In the days that followed, he saw her sit on the floor beside Lucas, handing him a red block and gently telling a story about a lost little fish trying to find its way home. She gave each character a different voice. She paused after each part, gazing into the boy's eyes, waiting for a response, even if it was just a blink. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't mechanical. She waited as though nothing else in the world mattered but that single moment. Another time, he saw her blowing soap bubbles in the corner of the room, letting them drift toward the ceiling in shimmering circles. Lucas blinked rapidly. Noah shifted his body more clearly than usual. Elena laughed, her eyes sparkling like a child's. She reached out not to touch them, but to bring her hand near so they knew she was there. Jonathan watched, and something inside him began to stir, like the soft ache of warmth returning to a long-numbed limb. Jonathan began watching the cameras more often. At first it was just a few minutes, then slowly hours slipped by without him even noticing. He didn't quite know what he was looking for. Maybe a mistake serious enough to end this before it got too far. Maybe some sign that she too, like all the others, would eventually take advantage, would cross a line, would fail him, and he would once again have to apologize to his sons for another adult who had broken something that could never quite be repaired. But the thing that unsettled Jonathan most wasn't the fear that she would fail. It was the quiet, growing realization that she might not. Elena never said the boys would walk. She never offered hollow promises, never filled the air with false hope. She simply did the work day by day, moment by moment, detail by detail. She never asked permission to bring in a small speaker that played soft classical music. No one had told her to read stories to children who had never smiled. No one trained her to play with bubbles or to draw animals on paper and lift them up like a game. But she did. Quietly. Consistently. Like someone who believed that dignity wasn't something you earned by ability but something you were born with. On the 9th day, Jonathan saw her fold a soft cloth into the shape of a rabbit, then place it gently on Noah's tray as if it were a gift. Noah didn't take it. He only looked at it, but he looked longer than he usually did. Elena said nothing. She simply smiled and left the cloth rabbit where it was. In that moment, Jonathan saw something that unsettled him in a way he didn't have language for. She wasn't trying to fix them. She wasn't trying to change them into something more palatable. She was simply trying to make sure they were seen. Not as diagnoses, not as cases, not as burdens to be managed, but as children. Children who deserved stories and toys and someone to greet them in the morning as if their presence mattered. Jonathan sat still in his office, eyes fixed on the screen. He wanted to be angry, wanted to pull her aside and remind her of the rules. But there was something he couldn't deny. Lucas was responding. Noah turned his head when she spoke. These were things that had never happened before. And if Elena was doing something wrong, it was a kind of wrong unlike any he had ever known. It was a wrong that made the sterile, lifeless therapy room seem warmer, more alive, more human, and that however faintly stirred something inside him that had been still for far too long. Jonathan still didn't trust her. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to stop her. He had never imagined he would linger this long in front of a security monitor. He used to loathe the footage, those endless loops of silence, the unmoving images of his children in their wheelchairs, the cold camera angles inside a room he had built to be a fortress of order. But ever since Elena began quietly breaking his rules, Jonathan couldn't look away. Not because he feared she would do something wrong, but because he was terrified he might miss something he no longer knew how to name. One weekday afternoon, when the sun slanted through the windows and spilled across the worn wooden floor of the therapy room, Jonathan watched Elena sit beside Lucas. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary, just placing a small yellow toy car on the table in front of him. It was a simple plastic car. No sounds, no flashing lights, nothing remarkable. But the way Elena set it down slowly, gently, with a kind of reverence, made it feel like a sacred gesture. And then she spoke so softly it barely registered over the hum of the surveillance feed. "Lucas, if you want to, you can try to touch it." Jonathan sat up straight, his eyes locked on the screen. For the first few seconds, Lucas didn't move. His eyes, wide and clear, were fixed on the toy car in front of him. Elena made no sound. She didn't touch him. She simply sat there, still and patient, holding the space with a silence so gentle it felt like an invitation. Then slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Lucas's small arm began to reach forward. The motion wasn't smooth. It wasn't steady. His clenched fingers trembled. His stiff arm stretched as if weighed down by invisible cords. But there was no mistaking it. He was trying. And then in a moment so fragile that Jonathan barely dared to breathe, Lucas's fingers brushed against the wheel of the car. It didn't roll, it didn't react, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that the hand had moved, not by reflex, not by chance, but with purpose, in response to a voice no one had ever believed would be heard. Jonathan stared at the screen in disbelief. He rewound the footage, watched it again, slower this time, then froze the frame at the exact instant the child's fingers met the toy. Somehow, through nothing more than steady presence and a voice as soft as air Elena had reached, Lucas had pulled him ever so slightly from the silent shell he'd been trapped in for 3 long years. The next day, Jonathan returned to the screen. Not out of fear, but hope, and he didn't have to wait long. This time it was Noah. Elena was seated in the middle of the room, a large picture book open on her lap, each page a watercolor of whimsical animals. She gave each creature its own voice, just like Grace used to. One page told the story of a little duckling who wanted to learn to fly. Elena's voice was smooth as silk, lilting through the room like spring sunlight drifting across the floor. Noah watched her more intently than usual, and then in a blink it happened. The corner of his mouth lifted, just a little, not a full smile, not obvious, but enough to make Jonathan spring from his chair. Noah had smiled. Not one of the doctors had ever said he could do that. None of the evaluations had recorded expressive movement at that level, and yet here it was clear, undeniable. And Elena. She didn't react with shock or celebration. She only paused for a heartbeat, looked at him, smiled back, and continued reading as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But Jonathan couldn't look away, because after 3 years he had grown used to stillness, to blank stares, to limbs that moved without intention. But now in just 2 days, both of his sons had shown him something that shattered the truths he had clung to for so long. They had reached beyond the borders he thought were unmovable. They had done something no one said was possible. And in the quiet glow of that room, once nothing more than a fortress of limits and routine, Jonathan began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jonathan didn't rewind the footage because he was suspicious. He rewound it because he needed to be sure that what he had just witnessed was real. His hand, damp with cold sweat, rested on the edge of the desk. A breath escaped his chest, heavy like stone, but behind it was something unfamiliar. Not quite hope. Not quite trust, but a pulse faint tentative from a place he thought had long gone silent. He stayed in his seat, watching his sons and watching the woman who now sat quietly between them. Elena was no miracle worker, but she had touched something Jonathan had feared was lost forever, a sign of life. And sometimes a single touch, a flicker of a smile, is enough to alter everything. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He remained in his office, the pale glow of the security screens casting a ghostly blue across his face, hollowed by months, no years of sleepless nights. He watched every moment from the day again and again. The small reach of Lucas's hand, the quick, fleeting smile on Noah's lips. Tiny things, but shattering. He wanted to believe, but part of him still held tight against it. Hope, when it has once died, never returns gently. It comes back like a storm, carrying both light and wreckage in its wake. And while Jonathan's heart began to stir, it also flinched, bracing for collapse. Then Elena took another step. The following morning, when Jonathan turned on the monitor as part of a ritual that had grown into something close to reverence, he saw her enter the therapy room carrying something new, a small white speaker, plain, unremarkable. She placed it on the shelf, plugged it in, and pressed play. Music filled the room, not the therapeutic tones prescribed by the specialists, not the ambient sounds pre-approved for children on the spectrum. This was Chopin, a soft, aching piano piece, gentle and deep, haunting in its beauty. Elena said nothing. She simply stood in the center of the room and closed her eyes for a few seconds, as if summoning something from a memory only she could hear. Then she opened them, bent down, and began moving Lucas's limbs to the rhythm. Jonathan shot upright. This was not in any therapy protocol. No medical expert had ever mentioned introducing classical music into physical rehabilitation. He opened his laptop and began to search frantically. Nothing definitive, nothing strong enough to be called a serious violation, but every alarm in his mind blared. She was improvising, teaching his children in a way entirely her own, and worse, his sons were responding. Lucas wasn't moving in full, obvious ways, but his head tilted ever so slightly to the beat. Elena said nothing, didn't prompt, didn't praise. She simply moved with him, trusting the repetition, the rhythm, the music. Then came Noah. Normally, therapy sessions left him completely silent, disconnected. But that day, as Elena shifted the music to something lighter, more playful, Noah's hand curled in, then opened, once, then again, as if his body was trying to catch up to a melody he hadn't known he could hear. Jonathan saw it all. His hand hovered over the call button, ready to summon her into his office. But then he paused, because there was something in Elena's eyes when she placed her hand gently on Lucas's shoulder to guide his leg upward, then down again. No strain, no force, just rhythm, presence, as if she was whispering into his muscles that they were not forgotten, that they still knew how to respond, that they were still alive. Jonathan let out a long breath and sank back into his chair. This was wrong. This was dangerous. She was giving the boys something he had buried long ago, hope, and that terrified him. Not because it was false, but because he didn't know if he could survive watching it break again. But Elena wasn't afraid. Day after day, she continued. She changed the music. Some days it was soft jazz, other days a bare acoustic melody. Occasionally it was an old children's song, sweet and slightly off-key. There was no formula, no curriculum, only intuition and an unshakable belief that movement and emotion belonged together like breath and body. And Jonathan, the man who had once demanded silence, now sat in that silence and listened, not for mistakes, but for music. Jonathan began to watch more closely, not just out of routine, but with a kind of quiet intensity he hadn't felt in years. He noticed the way Elena placed toys just far enough to make Noah reach, the way she tilted her head slightly, listening to Lucas's strained breathing to gauge his fatigue. The way she smiled, not with triumph, not with indulgence, but with a calm grace that made it seem as if every small progress came from the boys themselves, not from her hands. But it was that very precision, that subtlety, that frightened him most. Because what Elena was awakening in the house in him was something he had long since buried. The terrifying possibility that he had been wrong, that maybe the experts, the evaluations, the years of shaping his life around fear and restraint had missed the one thing that mattered most: belief. Elena wasn't breaking rules. She was refusing to live by limitations. And though Jonathan couldn't yet admit it, he was beginning to see a kind of miracle. In the music, in the motion, in the children he once believed would forever remain still. They were beginning to speak again to the world, not with words, but with life returning softly into each trembling joint and waking limb. He called Elena into his office on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun had begun to stretch long shadows across the wooden floors of the hallway. He sat behind the desk, hands folded, his expression so composed it barely concealed the war inside. Elena entered with the same steady step she always had, not hesitant, not hurried. She stood upright, hands clasped before her, waiting for him to speak. Jonathan pointed to the paused security footage, an image frozen of her gently rocking Noah's hand to music. His voice was even but taut. "You're doing things that aren't on the care plan, things unverified, things that might push them too far or give them the wrong idea about what they can do. You've crossed the line." Elena didn't blink. She nodded as if she had expected this conversation all along. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. Her voice was quiet, steady. She said she couldn't care for children as if they were machines in need of maintenance. That every time Noah opened his hand, every time Lucas lifted his head, it wasn't coincidence. It was response. It was connection. Jonathan turned away, letting his chair rotate slightly to the side, avoiding her gaze. He told her she was putting too much faith into something fragile. What if these signs were just unconscious reflexes? What if one day everything regressed again? He said he couldn't survive watching hope break a second time. There was a long silence. Then Elena stepped forward, only one step, not close, but enough to speak without the hum of the vent swallowing her voice. She said she understood that fear. She had seen children slip backward after progress. She had seen mothers collapse under the weight of too much hope. But she had also seen children defy every rule, not because of any protocol or perfect plan, but because someone dared to believe in the 1%. She told him calmly and clearly that if he no longer wanted her there, she would leave. But before he decided, she wanted to ask him one question. "When you look at your sons, what do you see? Medical cases? Or two little boys with names, with feelings, with eyes that follow the world around them?" She didn't ask him to believe in her. She asked him not to stop believing in them. Jonathan didn't respond. He just sat there silent, his eyes fixed on the desk, Inside his mind, images came in waves. Grace bent over her needlework, stitching their names into pillows. Lucas reaching for the yellow car, Noah smiling, Elena placing her hand over her heart as she sang a lullaby in a language he didn't understand without promises, only presence. He couldn't say when things had begun to shift, couldn't name the moment when he started waiting for something each time he turned on the cameras. But he knew that if he told Elena to stop now, he wouldn't just be silencing a woman who sang to his sons. He would be shutting down the only voice in this house that still dared to say, even the smallest miracle, no matter how fragile, is still worth waiting for. Elena left the room without another word. Jonathan remained seated for a long time afterward. In the stillness of the room, even silence seemed to gather around the space she had left behind, pulled inward like breath held too long. He didn't know if what he was doing was right, but for the first time in 3 years he no longer felt certain that being right out of fear mattered more than believing, even if that belief might be wrong. And that flicker of doubt, small, fragile, but piercingly real, opened a hairline crack in the wall he had built around himself. Just wide enough for light to slip through, only a thread. But it was the first. The door had been locked for 2 years. No one went near it. No one touched it. The former caretakers had called it the Forbidden Room. Jonathan never mentioned it, not because he was afraid of it, but because he knew something too clearly. Once that door opened, there would be nowhere left to hide from memory. But that afternoon, after his conversation with Elena, after she left the room without arguing, without pleading, leaving behind only a single question that still echoed in him, Jonathan rose from his chair and began walking toward the west wing of the house. The house was so quiet he could hear each fall of his shoes against the old wooden floor. Late sunlight spilled through the tall windows, soft and golden, stretching like pale ribbons across the hallway, lighting a path toward what he had spent 2 years trying to forget. The door was still there, off-white with a brass handle dulled by time. He hesitated. His hand hovered just above it. His heart pounded not from fear, but because what he was about to confront wasn't a room. It was himself, the man he had once been, the man who had believed in tomorrow, the husband who held his wife's hand while they picked out paint colors, who laughed as Grace painted little bears on the curtains. He turned the handle. The sound of the latch releasing was soft, but it struck him in the chest like the crack of something long, brittle, finally giving way under the weight of time. The room was untouched, not a trace of dust, not a single spider's web. Someone, one of the former caretakers perhaps, had quietly continued to clean it, even without permission to enter. Light filtered softly through the small window, falling across the 3 cribs arranged in a gentle arc. The thin blankets were neatly folded. The embroidered pillows still rested in place. Noah, Lucas, and one small white pillow without a name, bearing only the faint outline of a heart. Grace had begun to stitch, but never finished. The room felt frozen in time, caught in a moment of happiness that had never been completed. Jonathan stepped inside. His shoes creaked gently against the old wooden floor. He moved slowly, then sat down in the rocking chair by the window, the chair where Grace used to sit, reading aloud to the children still growing quietly inside her. He closed his eyes. The scent of lavender, her favorite oil, still lingered faintly in the air. On the inside of the cabinet door, a small note was still stuck, written in her careful, rounded handwriting. "Don't forget to sing to them every night, even when you're tired." Jonathan's hand trembled as he pulled it down. That message was for him. A fragment of a life Grace had tried to prepare but never had the chance to live. His throat tightened. All the months he had spent holding himself together, controlling, managing, isolating, just to avoid breaking, now crumbled into nothing more than a fractured shell. The tears that fell into his hands were not tears of pain, but of something deeper. The ache of remembering someone with love, not only with loss. He rose and walked toward the wall where Grace had painted. 2 little bear cubs held hands beneath the swaying branches of a tree. Below them, in faded, gentle script, were the words, "Where there is love, there is always a miracle." Jonathan reached out and touched the lettering lightly. For the first time, it didn't feel like a childish phrase. It felt like truth, a truth he had forgotten. Maybe love frightened him because it could not be measured, predicted, controlled. Maybe he feared placing his faith in something so uncertain, so fragile. He feared believing and then losing, hoping and then falling. But Grace had never been afraid. She had loved, she had believed, she had left her heart in this room without knowing what tomorrow would bring. Jonathan opened the window wide. Sunlight flooded in, filling the space with warmth and life. He turned back and looked at each small thing Grace had left behind. The pillows, the blankets, the cloth toys, a pair of tiny wool socks she had started knitting. All of it spoke in its quiet way of a woman who had never truly left. And he, the man who had sealed off his heart for so long, finally opened it not because Elena had changed him, but because she had reminded him of something he had tried to forget. That Grace was never truly gone. She had only been waiting for him to come back to this room, to begin again. Not from pain, but from love. The next day, Jonathan did something he hadn't done in over 2 years. He stepped into the therapy room in the middle of a session, not through a screen, not hidden behind a camera feed, but truly physically opened the door and walked inside. Elena was sitting on the floor with the boys holding a soft green dinosaur puppet, growling playfully as she brought it closer to Noah. She paused when she saw him, but only offered a quiet smile, then turned back to the game. Unbothered, unflinching. Jonathan didn't speak. He moved slowly to the chair near the window, sat down and simply watched. For the first time, the room didn't feel like a clinical space stripped of emotion. It felt like life, a place where something real could happen. Elena tilted her head and deepened her voice into a gentle rumble for the puppet. "Noah, be careful. This dinosaur's very hungry." She brought it close to his shoulder, pretending it was taking a playful bite out of his sleeve. And then in a moment so brief it seemed suspended in time, Jonathan heard something. A sound so small he thought at first he imagined it, but it came again. Soft, unmistakable. Noah laughed. Not a spasm. Not a reflex. A laugh. It bubbled from his throat, short and unsteady, but full of rhythm and feeling. Elena stopped. She didn't exaggerate the moment, didn't shout in excitement, or look to Jonathan for praise. Instead, she leaned forward, touched her forehead gently to Noah's, and whispered something only he could hear. And Jonathan, the man who had built an entire world of silence to protect himself from feeling, sat frozen, hands clasped his chest, clenched around an emotion too large to name. He tried not to cry, not out of pride, but because he wasn't sure he could stop once he began. He had lived too long in the dark. Even the smallest light made his eyes ache. But his son, his quiet, beautiful boy, had just left, and the world was no longer the same. He lowered his head, resting his hands in his lap, palms pressed together. Inside, something moved like water, long held behind a wall, now beginning to seep through the cracks. He remembered Grace remembered her voice when she used to say, "If one day our baby laughs, I won't need anything else." He had smiled at the time and said, "I'll make sure to record it for you." But Grace never got the chance to hear it. Elena stood across the room to fetch a cloth to wipe Noah's chin, moving with the same calm as always, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She didn't linger. She didn't look for approval. And that quietness, that refusal to make the moment about herself, made it feel even more sacred. No stage lights, no applause, just a child's laughter, and a father who had lived long enough under the weight of impossibility to recognize a miracle when it finally arrived. When Elena stepped out, giving them the room, Jonathan stood. He walked to Noah, knelt beside him, and gently placed his hand over the boys. Noah turned to look at him, and for the first time in years his eyes didn't seem lost. There was light in them, recognition, a quiet spark of connection. Jonathan reached up and touched his son's cheek, saying nothing, because there was no language vast enough for this, and he knew this was the first laugh, but it would not be the last. And even if tomorrow came slowly, even if there were setbacks today, just today, he had heard the one sound his heart had longed for and never truly believed it would receive. That day, no one made an announcement. No one wrote anything down. But somewhere deep within Jonathan's heart, a new marking was etched, a gentle inscription bearing the name of his son's first laugh. And from that moment on, he could no longer return to who he had been. He had heard life. And he knew he could not remain silent one moment longer. That night, Jonathan sat alone in the small library of the old house, a room he had used for little more than video calls and paperwork in recent years. The bookshelves were dust-covered, stacked with untouched medical journals and binders unopened since the day the pediatric hospital gave its final verdict. But tonight he returned to them. Not to challenge the diagnosis, not to seek contradictions, but to understand. To see if he had missed something, anything. On his laptop, he typed in a word Grace had once mentioned during one of their long, hopeful conversations: neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire, to adapt, to relearn lost functions after trauma. a concept he had brushed past 3 years ago, too fragile a light to follow back then. But now, after Noah's laughter, after Lucas's trembling reach, that concept pulsed with new life. He read every line, scribbled down notes, traced timelines. For the first time in years, he didn't just look, he truly saw that the human brain, especially in early development, could regenerate neural pathways with the right stimulation. That music, emotional connection, sensory input, and affection were not just soft comforts, they had measurable biological effects on damaged brain regions. He remembered Grace, the way she had held their sons, and whispered, "I don't care what the doctors say. I believe they can learn again. The human brain is the most miraculous thing God ever made." He had nodded then, just to calm her. But the truth was, part of him had already let go long before she ever did. He had treated science as a sentence final and sealed, no room for feeling, no room for dreams. But now it was science itself speaking to him again, not through cold numbers, but through living data, through research written by those who had witnessed what Elena was now planting slowly, quietly in their children. Jonathan opened the drawer and pulled out Grace's old notebook. He had once thought about burning it, but some voice inside had stopped him. He turned the pages slowly. Some were filled with notes she'd taken from an online seminar on neurodevelopmental recovery in infants. Others were written in her shaky hand after long nights of no sleep. "Today, Lucas held my finger for 2 seconds. It wasn't reflex. I know it. I believe." He read the line and felt as if someone had just whispered it beside him. "I believe." For the first time in 3 years, he didn't use the word miracle as a way to escape reality. Now, it felt like a calling, a process, something that could happen not with passivity, not by wishing, but through building, through showing up, through walking beside his sons instead of standing back behind screens and routines. He opened more articles, researched pediatric neurorehabilitation specialists, saved names, collected addresses, even looked into programs across different states, not to find someone to fix his children, but to find those who might help him understand them, who could walk with them as partners in this journey. He no longer wanted to fit his sons into the rigid mold of a diagnosis. He wanted to understand each blink, each flicker of movement, no matter how small. Because now each of those signs was not random. Each one was an answer, a whisper from their brains saying, "I'm trying," saying, "I'm reaching," saying, "I'm finding my way back." The room darkened as night fell, lit only by the soft glow of the screen and the steady, deliberate rhythm of keyboard strokes. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't working to forget his pain. He was working to move closer to life, to his sons, to the woman he had loved and lost, and to the man he used to be. The man who once dreamed of hearing his children laugh and call him Dad. And now he had heard it. And he knew this was not an ending. This was the beginning of a journey he had once turned away from. A journey of belief, of understanding, of never letting go again. 2 days after that long night spent poring over Grace's notes and rediscovering the quiet corners of science and hope, he had long abandoned Jonathan, invited Elena into the library. It was the first time he called her there, not to question or correct her, but to talk. The room felt warmer than usual, lit gently by the golden glow of an old desk lamp. Elena entered with a flicker of surprise in her eyes when she saw him already standing not behind the desk, but by the window holding a steaming cup of tea. He motioned for her to sit, then joined her, hesitating just a breath before he spoke. He told her about the articles he had read, the notes he had once ignored, and how he had come to see that he had been wrong to believe there was only one way to help his sons. One narrow, fixed path. Elena said nothing at first. She sat quietly, her fingers woven together in her lap, listening. Then she looked up, her eyes steady and unflinching. There was no reproach, no swelling emotion, just a gaze that was deeply human. And then she asked, "Have you ever really looked at your children, not through a camera, not through a diagnosis, but as a father looking at his sons?" Jonathan couldn't answer, because he knew he hadn't. He had seen their condition, he had seen their limitations, he had seen the numbers, the assessments, the charts. But he had not seen Lucas and Noah as children who had laughter inside them. Children who wanted to reach for the world even if their bodies betrayed them every day. Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice lowered, not like a caregiver explaining a method, but like a woman defending something sacred she refused to let be dismissed. "I'm not here to improve a case file," she said. "I came because these 2 boys are human beings. They are not projects looking for results, not experiments to test the faith of grown-ups. They're children. They have good days and they have bad days. Some days they want to be held. Some days they just need quiet. And the first thing anyone caring for them needs to do is stop seeing them as complicated cases. The words hit Jonathan like a soft pressure against the center of his chest. Not sharp, but undeniable. He remembered all the times he had glanced into the therapy room just to check the clock. All the times he had labeled success by reflex responses and failure by silence. He had forgotten that his children weren't born to prove anything. They were born to live, to feel, to be loved. Elena continued, her voice beginning to catch, not from personal emotion, but from the weight of knowing too well the quiet ache of children treated like breathing reports, like bodies measured in metrics instead of hearts asking to be seen. She said that on the very first day she stepped into this house, she did not see hope. What she saw was fear. Not from the children, but from the adults. Fear of hoping. Fear of failing. Fear of being hurt one more time. But if adults let fear decide everything, then the children would never get the chance to speak for themselves. Jonathan looked at her and his eyes softened. He let out a long, deep sigh, one that had clearly been held back for many days. He no longer denied it. He no longer blamed. He simply nodded. A slow, deliberate nod, the kind a man gives when he starts to take off the invisible armor he has worn for 3 years just to keep himself from breaking. He said he used to believe that by having no expectations, he would be safe from disappointment. But it turned out that very belief had stolen from him the chance to be a father, to be part of his children's journey instead of just a distant overseer. Elena smiled gently. She did not need an apology. All she needed was to see that the father was finding his way back, not with eyes that judged, but with the gaze of someone ready to listen and to start again. To relearn how to love, how to trust, how to sit beside his children, without demanding anything, only to be present. The room fell silent for a few moments. Then Jonathan handed Elena Grace's notebook. He said he had found it again. And for the first time since his wife passed away, he mentioned her name without defense, just a name light as a breath yet heavy with memory. And in that silence between two adults who had each braced themselves in their own way to protect the children, something quietly shifted. A pact made without signatures, a shared understanding that needed no promises. These were not medical cases, these were children. And from now on, they would be seen for who they truly were, children who deserved a chance to step into life in whatever way they could. Jonathan remembered that afternoon with striking clarity because even he had not expected it would become a quiet turning point in everything he thought he had under control. It all began with a call from the housekeeper reporting that Elena had taken the boys out into the back garden without informing anyone. No doctors, no support staff, no written approval from him, and most importantly, no explanation. Within less than 10 minutes, Jonathan was in the security room, hands trembling slightly as he rewound the camera footage. Part of him was furious. Part of him felt a rising panic. How could the boys be taken outside when neither had yet gained control of their bodies, when neither could even sit upright without harnesses? What had she been thinking? The footage appeared slowly on screen. All 3 of them were behind the house in the small garden that Grace had once tended with care throughout her pregnancy. Elena had laid out a large blanket on the grass, placing the 2 boys side by side beneath the shade of a wide maple tree. She did nothing grand. She simply let the wind run through their hair, let the sunlight touch their half-closed eyes, let the sound of birdsong slip into the air in place of the constant hum of machines. She had brought along a small radio playing classical music set far enough away that the sound was nothing more than a soft backdrop. She did not check the time. She did not rush through a therapy schedule. She simply sat there between the 2 children and sang, without needing a reason, without asking for permission. Just because she believed they deserved an afternoon beneath the open sky like any other child. Jonathan stared at the screen, the heat of anger rising in his throat like fire. She had crossed a line. She had done something he had never authorized, and for a few seconds, he thought about calling her in, thanking her for her time, and terminating her contract that very evening. He could not allow emotion to drive a process as fragile and full of risk as this one. But then, as if some unseen hand held him back, he didn't stand. He didn't call. He didn't speak. He just kept watching. 1 hour. Then 2. Dusk began to settle, and he was still sitting there. Night fell and the camera switched to low-light mode, capturing the hazy images of Elena gently covering the boys with a thin blanket, checking the temperature on each of their foreheads, adjusting their positions with quiet care. There was not a single careless movement, not a single trace of negligence. And it was that very stillness that held Jonathan's gaze. He saw Lucas blinking repeatedly as if reacting to the dimming light of dusk. He saw Noah pressing his lips together, a sign he had only ever shown when hearing a sound that comforted him. He saw that Elena was not breaking rules. She was returning the world to two children who had been shut away within four walls for far too long. And he, the one who should have done that first, was the last to understand. By dawn, when the footage ended and the boys were brought back to their room, Jonathan remained seated. The glow from the screen cast a pale light over his face, making each crease and line more pronounced. But these were not lines of anger. They were the lines of awakening. He understood that today might very well be the day he was supposed to fire Elena. She had not asked for permission. She had not followed protocol. But perhaps it was precisely because she hadn't asked that what she did was not shackled by fear. She had not tried to do what was correct. She had only tried to do what was necessary. And to Jonathan, that was worth more than any progress report. He closed the laptop, rose from his seat, and stepped into the hallway where the sound of his own footsteps echoed through the quiet night, like a reminder that some rules are made to protect, but others must be broken so that life can grow freely. And from that moment on, he knew he would not fire Elena. Not because she had been right, but because for the first time in years, someone had chosen kindness over safety. And sometimes that alone is what changes everything. Jonathan sat alone in the reading room, the armchair beneath the soft amber light of the corner lamp, seeming larger than usual. In front of him lay Grace's notebook, open to the middle where she had once sketched the two boys sleeping. The lines were clumsy but tender, just like the way she used to whisper when speaking of their future. Beside it sat a cup of tea that had gone cold. No one had brought it in. No one had reminded him to drink it. There was no meeting tonight, no urgent email, no financial decision waiting for his approval. There was only one question echoing in his mind over and over again, like a slow drumbeat that would not fade. What if she was right? He had always believed he was protecting his sons by controlling everything. A house designed for safety, cameras everywhere, caregivers replaced again and again for even the smallest deviation from protocol. He believed that the tighter the grip, the fewer the mistakes. But what was the cost of that tight grip? It had been 3 years in which Lucas and Noah lived like shadows in a picture frame. Present, but never truly alive. And it wasn't until a stranger dared to break the rules he had so carefully constructed that he finally saw his children as people, not as frozen medical conclusions. Jonathan pressed his elbow to his forehead, the other hand gripping the edge of the notebook where Grace's handwriting remained bold and clear. They need you more than they need a plan. He could not remember when she wrote it, but tonight the words rang through him like a bell striking memory. It had taken him 3 years to find the courage to admit he had severed his connection with his children. Not because he didn't love them, but because he was afraid. Afraid to hope only to break again. Afraid to see something not yet real and believe it anyway. Afraid that if he stepped too close, he would not survive the pain if they never improved. But what if Elena was right? What if emotional connection sound closeness? The sheer act of being present could not be replaced by rehabilitation schedules or modern intervention. What if all along the boys had only needed a father? Someone to believe in them before medicine could prove it. Jonathan no longer needed Elena to say another word. What she had done in the garden, in the therapy room, those quiet afternoons spent reading stories, or simply holding a child's hand in stillness. All of it was the unspoken language of a heart that knew how to listen. And that heart somehow had awakened the part of him he thought he had lost. The next morning, Jonathan did something he had not done in 3 years. He didn't go to work. He did not log into his usual virtual meetings. He did not put on a dress shirt or tighten his tie as he had each day without fail. Instead, he slipped into a soft sweater, stepped into fabric slippers, and quietly made his way to the therapy room at the exact hour Elena began her session. She paused for a moment when she saw him there. He said nothing, only bowed his head in greeting, then lowered himself onto the mat, sitting just a single arm's length from Noah and Lucas. Elena did not question him. She gave a quiet nod, then continued as usual, her voice steady as she read aloud from a picture book about a little elephant who could fly. Jonathan sat still, his eyes fixed on Lucas's small hand as it reached clumsily but with purpose toward a rattle lying just out of reach. He was no longer the employer, no longer the distant supervisor. He was the father of a child trying to tell the world he was still here. Slowly, Jonathan reached out his hand, meeting the tiny fingers of his son. Lucas paused, his eyes wide, looking directly at him. There was no clear response, no dramatic gesture, but something shifted, a quiet acknowledgement that his father was here, not through a camera, not from behind the door, but truly present. And in that fragile moment, Jonathan understood that he did not have to wait for his sons to walk or speak or call him by name to become their father. He could begin now, in this breath, by sitting beside them, by keeping his hand where it was, even when faced with uncertainty, by choosing to believe even when nothing was promised. It was not a grand act. No one filmed it, no medical bulletin would record it, but for Jonathan, it was the day he took his first step beyond fear. And in the quiet corner of his mind, the question that had once kept him awake at night now carried its own answer. What if she was right? Then he would never let go again. On Thursday, at 3 p.m, Jonathan was in his car returning from a brief meeting at the office. On the seat beside him sat a small paper bag, inside of which were 2 plush lion toys, the kind Grace had once said would be the perfect symbol of strength and resilience. He planned to bring them home for Lucas and Noah, a silent offering that said, "I am ready. I am truly ready to be part of your life." But as he stopped at a red light near home, his phone buzzed gently. A notification from the monitoring app. The camera in the therapy room had detected unusual movement. Almost without thinking, he unlocked the phone. How many times before had he done this, only to see the same quiet repetition, motionless legs, small efforts no one noticed? But this time, the image that appeared made his hands tremble slightly. On the screen, Lucas was standing. No rail to hold onto, no support harness. Just a pair of trembling legs, small arms reaching out to steady himself, and in his eyes a wild blend of fear and determination. Nearby, Noah sat upright, and Elena was seated between the 2 boys, her arms open wide, her voice cracking through the speaker filled with emotion as she said, "Come on, Lucas, you can do it. Just one more step." Jonathan couldn't breathe. His heart pounded so fiercely it felt like the sound was echoing in his ears. He barely dared to blink, terrified the image would vanish if he looked away for even a second. And then right before him, those tiny legs moved. One step, then another, awkward, unsteady, but without anyone holding him up, just the boy himself and a will that had been burning quietly for 3 long years. Noah, as if awakened by the very air shifting around him, began to push himself forward too. He reached out toward Elena, mimicking his brother's motion, straining to follow. Jonathan couldn't look away. What he was witnessing wasn't chance. It was the sum of every unseen effort, of that afternoon in the garden, of the songs sung in the quiet of the evening, of every embrace, of the therapy sessions that ignored the textbook, of trust and of love. He didn't drive. He didn't honk the horn. He didn't call anyone. He sat motionless behind the wheel, frozen in traffic, tears falling before he realized they had started. For 3 years he had imagined miracles of every kind, but not once had the image been this real. His twin sons, the boys once diagnosed with futures that held no steps of their own, were walking. In the soft light of late afternoon, under the calm gaze of a woman who dared to believe what the rest of the world had long refused. Elena didn't cry. She only pressed her lips together, looking up as though sending something unspoken into the open air. She didn't know someone was watching through the screen. She didn't know the father who had once locked his heart away was now trembling in his car like a boy who had just discovered that miracles might be real after all. Jonathan brought a hand to his mouth. The emotion was no longer a feeling. It was a wave crashing through every wall he had built. For the first time, he understood what it meant to hope, not with logic, but with the willingness to believe in what could not yet be seen. And now what he had never dared imagine was unfolding before his eyes. Lucas moved closer to Elena. She didn't catch him. She only reached out and touched his back lightly, the way one does when affirming a child's direction, without taking away their independence. Noah strained to rise his footing, uncertain, but his eyes no longer wandered blankly. They searched for someone to follow. And Jonathan knew he could not remain in that car a second longer. With trembling hands still on the steering wheel, he turned the vehicle around, his heart pounding not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt in years. He was alive, truly alive. And he knew when he walked into that room, he would no longer be the man he had been for the past 3 years. He would be a father. And today, Thursday at 3 in the afternoon, would be the day his life began again. The therapy room door burst open as Jonathan rushed in without thinking. Elena looked up briefly startled but said nothing when she saw his face. She didn't need to. No words could explain, and none were required. Jonathan walked straight to the center of the room where Lucas now stood, legs wobbling with each breath. The boy turned at the sound of footsteps, his eyes wide as if not believing what they saw. Not a single word was spoken, but in that short, suspended instant, something invisible reconnected between father and son. Jonathan knelt down, arms open, and Lucas, summoning every last bit of strength in his small, unsteady frame, took another step. Then another, until he collapsed into his father's arms, his whole body light as a leaf. Jonathan held him tightly, his hands trembling as they closed around that small back, terrified that if he let go it would all vanish like a dream that fades the moment you wake. He had never cried like this. Not when Grace died, not when he first heard the diagnosis, not during all those long nights spent staring at the camera feed before silently closing the laptop like sealing a door inside his chest. But now the tears came freely, uncontrollably, and as he cradled Lucas in his arms, Noah made his way over, swaying but determined, then sat down beside them, leaning into his father's leg. Jonathan wrapped his arms around both sons, his chest heaving with emotion too vast to name. Awe, gratitude, regret, and a joy so pure it hurt to hold. Emotions he had once believed were no longer meant for him. But today, in a room lit by nothing more than soft afternoon light, surrounded by the quiet breath of his children and the presence of a woman who never gave up. Jonathan felt it, not hope from a chart, not faith from a report, but something real, something earned, and he knew from this moment forward he would never close that door again. Elena stepped back, standing still for a long, quiet moment, as if to honor the sacredness of what was unfolding before her. Then she moved closer, sitting down beside them, not touching the children, not interrupting what belonged to them and their father. She was simply there, present. Jonathan lifted his eyes to her, and they were red not from anger, not from restraint, but from something raw and human. The sharpness, the caution he once wore like armor had melted away. His voice was low, thick with emotion as he asked, "How did you do it?" Elena didn't answer right away. She turned to look at the two boys leaning against each other in their father's embrace, then smiled softly, almost imperceptibly, as if what she was about to say was not some great revelation, but the simplest truth in the world. "I just believed in them." The words didn't come out like a declaration. They were more like a breath, a truth too quiet to need proof. Jonathan bowed his head, his forehead resting gently on Lucas's hair, and then he whispered not to anyone but himself, "I was afraid to believe because I was afraid to lose again." Elena nodded. "I know. But children don't need perfection, they need presence." The words echoed in his mind over and over. Presence. What had he done with the last 3 years? He had been there in the most literal sense, yet his heart had not truly been with his sons. He had let grief decide everything, had turned himself into a father who existed in name but not in spirit, even inside his own home. But now what he had thought would never be possible was resting in his arms. No longer a dream, no longer a miracle from some distant, unreachable place, but the living result of love, of persistence, and of a belief that asked for nothing in return. He looked at Elena, and for the first time his eyes held true gratitude, not as an employer, not as the man who once questioned every decision, but as a father who had just been given back the children he feared he had already lost. He said, "You gave me more than 2 boys who can walk. You made me want to be their father again." Elena smiled gently, her eyes shining with unshed tears, though she did not cry. She placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, then stood and quietly left the room, leaving Jonathan there in the soft flood of afternoon light where 2 children leaned into him. And for the first time in many years, he no longer feared tomorrow, because now he believed. And sometimes everything begins with a belief just that small. That night, long after Lucas and Noah had fallen asleep in their father's arms, Jonathan remained seated at the edge of the bed. He didn't turn on the light. He let the soft glow from the small bedside lamp cast its quiet warmth across the boys' faces. He didn't leave the room as he usually did. He didn't close the door and walk down to the library. He didn't check his email or bury himself in work to avoid the weight of what was real. He simply sat there, hands clasped, shoulders bent forward as though carrying something unnamed that had grown heavy over time. Then he whispered for the first time in 3 years in a low, hoarse, trembling voice, "I'm sorry." There was no reply, only the steady rhythm of his son's breathing and the faint rustling of wind beyond the glass. But still Jonathan went on. He apologized for being there, but not truly present, for letting fear convince him that his sons weren't enough to hope for and choosing control over love, for turning love into duty pain, into a barrier, and silence into a shield against a heart that was breaking. He lowered his head, lips trembling as he spoke her name. Grace, a name that had become both wound and prayer, and he whispered as if she were beside him, "I'm sorry." He was sorry for not keeping the promise he made to her on that final night before the birth. She had held his hand cold, sweat gathering at her temples, still trying to smile through the pain, as she said, "If anything happens, you have to live fully. For them." He had nodded, then tears falling onto the back of her hand. But after she was gone, he hadn't lived. He had merely existed. Her death had taken more than the warmth of a wife. It had taken the last thread of faith he had in the future. He closed her room, locked away every memory, and told himself that if he didn't dream, he wouldn't be disappointed. But it was that very refusal to dream that had stolen his children's chance at more. Jonathan rose and walked to Grace's old room, which he had only recently opened again. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, laying a quiet silver dust over everything. Her framed prints still hung where she'd placed them. The tiny clothes she had folded were untouched in the drawer. He sat on the floor beside the chair she used to read in each afternoon and whispered into the air as though speaking to something just out of reach. "Grace, I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you always believed. I hid inside reason, inside fear, and in the process I lost myself. But today, I saw them. Lucas and Noah. Not as broken, but as extraordinary, as strong, as fully alive. They walked, Grace. Did you hear that? They really walked?" He didn't expect an answer. But something within him lightened, as if that long-delayed apology had been received by a forgiveness that required no words. From his pocket, he pulled out an old photo. It was the three of them taken during their first ultrasound. Grace's hand was resting on her belly, and he was staring at the screen with a look so full of joy it seemed lit from within. He placed the photo on the desk beside her unfinished journal. Then he returned to his son's room, where the boys were still asleep. Noah's hand resting naturally across Lucas's stomach. Jonathan lay down beside them, not to monitor but to share in their stillness. He placed one hand gently on Lucas's chest, the other across Noah's shoulder. And for the first time since the day they were born, he closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from peace. No more cameras in his mind, no more doctors' voices echoing in the dark. Just a father learning how to love again. Not perfectly, but honestly. And deep in the quiet center of his being, he understood that apologies could not change the past, but they could open a door to something new. A future where Grace remained present not only in memory, but in the footsteps of two little boys the world once called impossible. The next morning, Jonathan woke earlier than usual. He didn't rush downstairs to his office or reach for his phone to check messages from the management team. Today, the first thing he did was step into the kitchen and make a pot of coffee with his own hands. Then he walked slowly down the quiet hallway of the old house where the morning sun was streaming softly through the tall, antique glass windows. Everything around him looked the same, yet he was no longer the same man. Something within him had changed forever, beginning with the moment Lucas and Noah took their first steps, continuing through the embrace that followed, and settling deep into his bones when he whispered an apology from the heart. And this morning, for the first time in many years, Jonathan wanted to begin again. But this time, not through control, through trust. He sat at his desk, pulled out a notebook, and turned to a fresh page. At the top, in bold strokes of blue ink, he wrote, "Comprehensive recovery plan for Lucas and Noah." Not a treatment schedule, not a rigid protocol built from clinical data, but a journey, an unfolding of possibility. He began listing what needed to be done, not as a wealthy man assembling a team of specialists, but as a father actively seeking to help his children grow at the pace of their own rhythm. He made a note to call the neurologist for updates. to consult with experts on early neurorehabilitation, to schedule a fresh full assessment of the boy's motor abilities. But this time he wasn't searching for certainty. He was seeking understanding so he could walk alongside them better. Jonathan also carefully noted what Elena had done, not to audit her, to learn from her, the storytelling sessions, the creative exercises combining music and movement, time outside surrounded by nature. He wanted these things not as occasional exceptions, but as formal parts of the recovery plan, no longer rule-breaking, no longer side notes, but the foundation. He even called an old friend and architect to discuss remodeling part of the house. His idea was to transform the living room into an open therapeutic space with soft mats, natural light, an area for walking practice, and a warm reading corner. On the call, he was clear. "I don't want the house to look good. I want it to be alive." Elena was surprised when she received a message from Jonathan inviting her to a private meeting. But it wasn't the cold, formal kind held in his office, not like before. They sat outside in the backyard, where the old wooden chairs had weathered with time, but now felt warmer than ever. Jonathan opened his notebook and handed it to her, showing her his notes, then spoke with a sincerity she had not heard from him before. "I don't want you to just be their caregiver. I want you to be the lead advisor in my son's recovery plan." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded gently without a word. But in her eyes there was a quiet recognition. As if at last they were standing on the same ground, looking in the same direction. That afternoon, Jonathan made a call to Grace's mother. She had once been quietly, deeply disappointed in how he had drifted away from his children. But this time her voice on the other end of the line was not sharp, not burdened by judgment. She said just one sentence that caught in his throat and held him still. "My son, Grace, would be so proud of you." Jonathan couldn't answer. He simply held the phone to his ear for a long while, letting the tears fall without resistance. They were no longer the tears of loss. They were the tears of a man who had finally found a reason to keep moving forward. That evening, he sat beside his children's bed, one small hand in each of his. He began reading a fairy tale, one that Grace used to read aloud on quiet nights. He didn't know how much they could understand. But that no longer mattered. For the first time, Jonathan wasn't aiming for results. He was simply present. And in that presence, a new world had begun to open, one that followed no strict rule, one free from diagnosis or prediction. A world that moved by the rhythm of love and by the limitless potential that lives in every child. And Jonathan, after years confined by structure and fear, had now stepped into that world with a heart more open than it had ever been. The sun was setting slowly outside the children's bedroom window as Jonathan closed the book in his lap. Lucas leaned his head against his father's shoulder, and Noah clutched the worn yellow stuffed lion that had become his nightly companion. The once silent house, still as a museum, had awakened. There were footsteps now. Laughter, soft music playing through the halls each afternoon. The living room, once gray and cold, had been transformed into a warm space for play and therapy. The walls were now filled with the boys' crayon drawings and new photographs capturing the unfolding miracle of their little family. Jonathan sat in the middle of that room, surrounded by light and warmth, watching his son sleep, and he no longer feared tomorrow. Tomorrow no longer loomed as something dark and unknowable. It had become something else entirely. A possibility. A promise. That good things could still happen even after all hope seemed lost. He stood gently, tucked the blanket over their small bodies, and stepped out of the room with a quiet that felt more like peace than retreat. As he walked past the hallway, his eyes paused on an old photo hanging on the wall. Their wedding portrait, him and Grace. He smiled, not a smile through tears, but the kind that comes when peace has finally returned after a long storm. Jonathan's story is not just a tale of recovery for two boys once believed to be unable to walk. It is a story of a father learning how to forgive himself. A man who dared to loosen his grip on control and allowed love to lead him instead. It is proof that even the most unlikely things can unfold if met with faith, patience, and a heart willing to remain open. Above all, it is a quiet reminder that miracles don't always arrive with grandeur or spectacle. Sometimes a miracle is simply someone willing to sit down, listen, love, and never give up. Just as Elena had done, just as Jonathan had learned to do. Dear friend, how did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? A person who once believed in you when the world didn't? Or perhaps someone you turned away from because of a fear you couldn't name? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. We would be honored to hear what's resting in your heart, because every person carries a story worth telling, a pain that longs to be healed and a miracle waiting to be named. And if this story touched something within you, don't hesitate to like, share, and subscribe to the Emotional Echoes YouTube channel. Every day we bring you stories that are moving, human, and full of hope. Thank you for listening truly all the way to the end. We wish you good health, a life filled with peace, and a heart that stays warm no matter how the world turns. Until next time, take care, and may your tomorrow always hold something to hope for.